In the scorched badlands of 1870s New Mexico territory, the line between mercy and suicide is drawn not in sand, but in blood. What happens when a woman cast out by her own people and clinging to survival in a land that wants her dead, discovers a warrior dying beneath the merciless sun? She sees only a life worth saving, not the storm his identity will unleash. But she has no idea that the man she's dragging across burning sands with her last ounce of strength is Lochni, the only son of the most powerful Modoc war leader in the southwest, and that her single act of compassion is about to ignite a war that will force her to choose between the world she lost and the one she never knew she needed. The desert doesn't forgive. It doesn't negotiate. It simply waits with the patience of stone and the hunger of fire for every living thing to make that one fatal mistake. Ember Wilder had learned this truth the hard way, carved into her sun-darkened skin and the hollows beneath her eyes. She had survived 3 brutal summers in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a stretch of New Mexico badlands so hostile that even the Apache called it cursed. At 26, Ember had the hands of a woman twice her age, calloused from digging for water in dry creek beds, scarred from gathering barrel cactus in the dark, and stained permanently brown from the medicinal plants she harvested to survive. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat according to her mother, was now sun-bleached and wild, kept back with a strip of leather she'd cut from her boot when the original tie had rotted away. Her dress, what remained of it, was a patchwork of canvas, deer hide and desperation. She lived in what could barely be called a shelter, a half-collapsed adobe hut built into the side of an arroyo, hidden from casual eyes by a stand of ancient mesquite trees. The structure had been there long before her, built by Spanish missionaries perhaps, or prospectors who'd learned too late that this land held no gold, only death. Ember had fortified it with salvaged timber, rocks and mud, creating something that kept out the worst of the sandstorms and provided shade when the sun turned the desert into a furnace. The people of Salvation Ridge, the nearest settlement 40 miles to the east, had a name for her. They called her the Witch of the Wasteland, though never to her face, because none of them dared venture into her territory. They told stories about her in whispers, that she'd murdered her husband and fled into the desert, that she'd gone mad from isolation and now talked to spirits, that she could curse a man with a glance and heal another with strange pagan rituals learned from the savages. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more damning. Ember had been married once, to a man named Thomas Wilder, a cruel drunk who'd won her in a card game from her debt-ridden father. For 2 years, she'd endured his fists and his rage until the night he'd come home with murder in his eyes and a knife in his hand, screaming about how she'd shamed him by speaking out of turn to the preacher. She'd grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace and struck him once hard across the temple. He dropped like a stone. She hadn't stayed to see if he was dead or alive. By sunrise, she was 50 miles into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back, a canteen, and her mother's medicine bag. The posse had tracked her for 3 days before the desert convinced them she wasn't worth dying for. They'd returned to Salvation Ridge and declared her dead, killed by Apaches or thirst or her own sins. It was easier than admitting a woman had escaped them, but Ember hadn't died. She'd learned. Her mother, God rest her soul, had been what polite society called an herb woman and what the less polite called a witch. She'd taught Ember the old ways before consumption had taken her when Ember was 15, how to find water by reading the flight of birds, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to brew poultices from creosote and jimson weed, how to set bones and stitch wounds and bring down fevers, knowledge that respectable women weren't supposed to have, but which had kept Ember alive when everything else had tried to kill her. The Modoc people knew she was here. She'd encountered their scouts twice in 3 years, both times at a distance. They'd watched her with the wariness reserved for unpredictable things, neither hostile nor friendly. when she'd found a haunch of deer meat hanging from a mesquite branch near her shelter, still fresh, and she'd known it was a gift or perhaps a test. She'd taken it, smoked it carefully, and left a bundle of medicinal sage tied with grass in the same spot. It had been gone by morning. Since then, they'd left her alone, and she'd returned the favor. It was this fragile, unspoken truce that made what happened on the 5th day of August so catastrophic. Ember had been checking her snare lines near Dead Man's Canyon, a narrow slash in the earth where rainwater sometimes pooled in the rocks, creating a thin ribbon of life in the wasteland. She'd caught a jackrabbit, lean and tough but meat nonetheless, and was resetting the trap when she heard the gunfire. It came from the north, sharp cracks that echoed off the canyon walls. 3 shots, a pause, then 2 more. Ember froze, her heart hammering. Gunfire in the desert meant one of 3 things. Hunters, unlikely this deep in Modoc territory. Soldiers, possible but foolish. Or a skirmish, which meant blood and trouble she wanted no part of. The smart thing, the sane thing, was to take her rabbit and disappear back to her shelter. The desert had taught her that survival meant minding your own business. But then came the scream. It wasn't the high-pitched shriek of fear. It was a roar of rage and pain combined, a sound of someone fighting not to die. It was followed by the thunder of hooves and more gunshots, closer now. Ember dropped low behind a boulder, her rabbit forgotten, and watched as 4 riders came tearing around the canyon bend. They wore the dusty blue of the U.S. cavalry, though their uniforms were stained with sweat and desert grit. They were riding hard, whipping their horses with reckless desperation, and even from a distance, Ember could see the fear on their faces. Behind them, closing fast, were Modoc warriors. 6 of them, riding bareback on painted ponies, their faces streaked with war paint, bows and rifles in hand. The chase was brutal and one-sided. The cavalry's horses were exhausted, stumbling on the rocky ground. One soldier's mount went down, throwing its rider hard. The man tried to scramble to his feet, but an arrow took him in the back before he'd made it 3 steps. He fell and didn't move again. Ember pressed herself against the rock, willing herself invisible. This was not her fight. This was not her world. But as the remaining soldiers disappeared around another bend, the warriors slowing to finish what they'd started, something else caught her eye. Movement in the wash below, near a cluster of prickly pear. At first, she thought it was a wounded animal, the way it crawled and then collapsed. But then she saw the dark fall of hair, the brown skin slick with blood, and the distinctive beadwork on what remained of a leather vest. It was a Modoc warrior, and he was dying. He'd been shot. That much was clear from the way he clutched his side, blood seeping through his fingers in steady pulses. A second wound on his thigh had torn through muscle, leaving his leg useless. He'd crawled perhaps 20 feet from where his horse lay dead, an arrow still protruding from its neck. His bow was gone, his rifle crushed beneath the horse. He was unarmed, alone, and from the way he moved, barely conscious, every instinct Ember had developed over 3 years of survival screamed at her to stay hidden. If his people found her near him, they might think she'd caused this. If the soldiers circled back and found her helping him, they'd shoot her for treason. And even if neither happened, this man was dangerous. He was a warrior, trained to kill, and she was alone and vulnerable. Helping him was madness. It was suicide. The warrior's hand slipped from his side. He pitched forward into the sand, his breathing a wet, rattling sound that Ember could hear even from 30 feet away. He was drowning in his own blood. Without help, he'd be dead in minutes. And then he turned his head, just slightly, and his eyes met hers. They were dark and fierce, burning with a will to live so intense it seemed to scorch the air between them. He didn't speak. He didn't beg. He just looked at her with those eyes that said fighter, survivor, and something in Ember's chest cracked open. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, soft and sad, from a night long ago when they tended to a drifter who'd been beaten and left for dead by bandits. Some folks will tell you there's types of people worth saving and types that aren't, her mother had said, her hands never stopping their work. But pain doesn't have a color or a creed, Ember. A life is a life. You turn your back on that, you might as well be dead yourself. Damn it! Damn him, damn her mother for teaching her to care. Ember made her decision in the space of a heartbeat, knowing it was probably the last decision she'd ever make. She left her cover and scrambled down into the wash, her boots sliding on loose rocks. The warrior watched her approach, his hand moving weakly toward where his knife should have been. But he had no strength left for fighting. As she dropped to her knees beside him, his eyes rolled back and his body went slack. Up close, the damage was catastrophic. The bullet in his side had punched clean through, leaving an exit wound the size of a silver dollar that was pumping blood with each fading heartbeat. The leg wound was messier, the bullet still lodged deep in the muscle. He'd lost too much blood already. His lips were grey, his breathing shallow. By all rights, he should already be dead. But his heart was still beating, stubborn and strong, fighting for every second. Ember tore strips from her already tattered skirt, wadding them against the worst of the bleeding. The fabric turned red almost instantly. She needed to move him, needed to get him somewhere she could work. But he was easily twice her weight, all muscle and bone and deadweight unconsciousness. The sun was climbing higher, turning the desert into an oven. If she didn't get him to shade, the wounds would be the least of his problems. She looked around desperately and spotted an overhang in the canyon wall, a shallow cave worn by ancient waters. It wasn't much, but it was closer than her shelter and offered protection from the sun. Making a choice born of desperation, Ember grabbed the warrior under his arms and pulled. He didn't budge. She adjusted her grip, planting her feet, and pulled again with every ounce of strength she possessed. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him through the sand, his blood leaving a dark trail behind them. It took her 20 minutes to move him 30 feet. By the time she got him into the shade of the overhang, her arms were shaking, and her vision was swimming with black spots. But there was no time to rest. She could hear voices in the distance, the Modoc warriors calling to each other as they searched the area. They'd find the dead soldier soon. They'd start looking for their missing warrior. She had minutes at best. Ember worked with the desperate speed of someone who knew death was watching over her shoulder. She packed the wounds with a poultice made from crushed yarrow and cobwebs, an old trick her mother had taught her to stop bleeding. She bound his side and leg tightly with more strips of her skirt, sacrificing modesty for necessity. His breathing was still ragged, his skin cold and clammy despite the heat. He was going into shock, his body shutting down. She needed water, needed to get fluids into him, but her canteen was back at her shelter. What she had was a small water skin she kept for emergencies, barely half full. She dribbled a little between his lips, watching his throat work reflexively to swallow. It was something. It was enough to keep him alive for another hour, maybe. But he needed more. He needed real medicine, rest, and more care than she could give him in a cave, with warriors hunting nearby. The voices were getting closer. Ember made another impossible choice. She pulled a blanket from her pack, an old wool thing she'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead, and draped it over the warrior, covering him completely and piling loose sand and rocks around the edges to make it look like just another shadow in the cave. Then she scrambled out, brushed away the most obvious blood trails with a mesquite branch, and moved 50 feet down the canyon to her original hiding spot behind the boulder. She made herself small, made herself invisible, and waited. 3 Modoc warriors appeared around the bend, moving with the fluid silence of men who'd been born to this land. They were younger than she'd expected, perhaps in their 20s, their faces painted with red and black stripes. One of them, taller than the others, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, was clearly the leader. He raised a hand, and they stopped, their eyes scanning the canyon with the intensity of hawks searching for prey. They saw the blood trail, saw where it led toward the overhang. The scarred warrior notched an arrow and moved forward cautiously, the other 2 flanking him with rifles ready. Ember's heart was hammering so hard she was certain they could hear it. If they found the wounded man, they'd find her handiwork. They'd know someone had tried to save him. And then they'd start looking for that someone. The scarred warrior reached the overhang. He crouched down, peering into the shadows. Ember saw his eyes narrow, saw his hand tighten on the bow. And then, miraculously, impossibly, a hawk screamed overhead. All three warriors looked up instinctively, and in that moment of distraction, a voice called out from further up the canyon. It was urgent, commanding, speaking in the Modoc language Ember didn't understand, but its meaning was clear. They were being summoned. The scarred warrior hesitated, torn between investigating the cave and obeying the call. The voice came again, sharper this time. With obvious reluctance, he stood, barked something to his companions, and they moved away, heading back up the canyon at a run. Ember didn't move, didn't breathe. She stayed frozen behind her boulder for a full 10 minutes after their voices had faded, making absolutely certain they were gone. When she finally moved, her legs were trembling so badly she nearly fell. She scrambled back to the overhang and pulled away the blanket. The warrior was exactly as she'd left him, still unconscious, still bleeding sluggishly through the bandages, but alive. Against all odds and all logic, still alive. And now he was her responsibility, a weight heavier than his body, a choice she couldn't unmake. Getting him back to her shelter would be impossible in daylight. The Modoc were searching the area, and moving a bleeding man across open desert would be suicide. She'd have to wait for nightfall, which meant spending the next 6 hours in this cave with a dying warrior, hoping his people didn't come back and hoping he didn't die before she could get him somewhere safe. It was the longest, most terrifying afternoon of Ember Wilder's life. She used the time to gather what she could from her surroundings. More yarrow growing in a crack in the rocks. Devil's claw pods that could be made into a drawing poultice. Yucca roots she could pound into a cleansing wash. Her hands worked automatically, falling into the patterns her mother had taught her, while her mind spun with the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd saved a Modoc warrior, an enemy according to the soldiers, a savage according to the people of Salvation Ridge, but looking at him now with the war paint smudged by sweat and blood, he didn't look savage. He looked young, younger than she'd first thought, maybe 23 or 24. He had a strong face, all sharp angles and fierce pride even in unconsciousness. There was a leather cord around his neck with what looked like a bear claw hanging from it. His hands, limp at his sides, were warrior's hands, scarred and calloused, but long-fingered and capable. He was someone's son, maybe someone's brother, a person, not a monster. As the sun finally began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, the warrior stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with fever. He tried to move, gasped in pain, and his hand flew to the wound in his side. His gaze found Ember, and for a moment confusion warred with instinct. His other hand moved toward his knife, but of course it wasn't there. He tried to sit up, failed, and fell back with a groan that sounded torn from his soul. Ember held up both hands, palms out, universal language for I mean no harm. She reached slowly for her water skin and held it out to him. He stared at it, then at her, his eyes calculating despite the fever burning in them. She could see him trying to make sense of it. A white woman alone offering water. His people must have taught him that white gifts came with strings, came with betrayal. But thirst and pain won out over suspicion. He took the skin with a shaking hand and drank deeply. When he'd finished, he handed it back, his eyes never leaving her face. He said something in his language, a question or maybe an accusation. Ember shook her head. "I don't understand," she said softly. "I found you. You were dying. I'm trying to help." She gestured to his bandages, to the medicine plants she'd gathered. "Help, understand?" His jaw tightened. He said something else, more forcefully this time. And then his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again, his body surrendering to the trauma it had endured. When full darkness finally fell, Ember made her move. She fashioned a crude travois from mesquite branches and the remains of her blanket, a trick she'd seen once in a traveling show's demonstration of Indian ways. She rolled the warrior onto it as gently as she could, his weight making the branches creak alarmingly. And then, with the stars emerging like distant witnesses to her madness, she began the long, agonizing journey back to her shelter. She pulled him across 2 miles of desert, stopping every few hundred feet to catch her breath and check that he was still breathing. The travois caught on rocks and bushes. Her hands blistered and then bled. Her back screamed in protest. But she kept moving, one step at a time, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant watching him die. And for reasons she couldn't explain or justify, that was the one thing Ember Wilder couldn't do. By the time she dragged him through the entrance of her shelter, the moon was high, and she was hallucinating from exhaustion. She pulled him inside, collapsed beside him, and for just a moment let herself believe she'd done the impossible. She'd saved him. Against the desert, against the soldiers, against her own fear, she'd saved a life. Her mother would have been proud. But as consciousness faded and sleep claimed her, one thought echoed through Ember's mind like a warning drum. She'd saved a Modoc warrior, and when he woke up, when his people came looking, when the soldiers learned what she'd done, the fragile existence she'd built in this wasteland would come crashing down. She traded her isolation for a war, her safety for a stranger, and there was no going back. Outside, the desert wind began to blow, carrying with it the scent of coming storms and the distant sound of drums. The Modoc were gathering. They were looking for their lost warrior, the son of their war leader, the heir to everything they were fighting for. And Ember Wilder, the witch of the wasteland, had just become the most dangerous woman in the New Mexico territory, whether she knew it or not. Ember woke to the sound of thunder, except there were no clouds. The sound was coming from inside her shelter, from the warrior's chest as he fought for breath. 3 hours of restless sleep had done nothing to ease her exhaustion, but the ragged wheeze of dying lungs was better than any alarm. She forced herself upright, her muscles screaming in protest, and crawled over to where Lockney lay on her only bedroll. The infection had set in with terrifying speed. His skin was burning to the touch, radiating heat like a forge stone. The bandages she'd wrapped around his torso were soaked through with a mixture of blood and something yellowish that made her stomach turn. She'd seen infection before, had watched it devour men stronger than this warrior. Without proper medicine, without the ability to clean the wounds thoroughly, he had maybe 2 days before the fever consumed him entirely. Her shelter had never been meant to house 2 people, let alone serve as a makeshift surgery. The single room was barely 12 feet across, with a ceiling so low Ember had to stoop in places. Her possessions were sparse and practical. A cast-iron pot for cooking, a collection of gourds and clay vessels for storing water, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and creosote. A trunk containing her mother's medical tools, salvaged from their old life and worth more than gold in this wasteland. And now, taking up most of her floor space, an unconscious Modoc warrior who was either going to live or die based entirely on her skill. She built up the fire, not caring that the smoke might give away her position. Heat was necessary for what came next. She pulled her mother's leather roll from the trunk, unwrapping it with reverent care to reveal a dozen instruments. Scalpels, forceps, a bone saw she prayed she wouldn't need, needles and catgut for suturing. They were old, some of them probably older than Ember herself, but they'd been maintained with obsessive care. Her mother had taught her that a healer's tools were extensions of their hands, and dirty hands killed as surely as bullets. Ember spent the next hour preparing. She boiled water in her pot, adding handfuls of wild tobacco leaves to create a cleansing wash. She ground dried echinacea root into a paste that could fight infection from the inside. She stripped away the soaked bandages from Lockney's wounds, revealing the full extent of the damage in the flickering firelight. The exit wound in his side had begun to fester, the edges turning black. The bullet in his thigh was buried deep, surrounded by swollen, angry flesh. This was going to hurt. Even unconscious, the body knew pain, and there was nothing she could give him to dull it. No laudanum, no whiskey, nothing but her hands and her determination. She positioned herself beside him, took a deep breath to steady her shaking fingers, and began to work. The scalpel bit into infected flesh, draining the poison that had pooled beneath the skin. Lockney's body jerked, a groan tearing from his throat, but he didn't wake. She worked quickly, cutting away the dead tissue, flushing the wound with her tobacco wash. The bullet in his thigh was worse. She could feel it with her fingers, lodged against the bone, surrounded by muscle that had contracted around it like a fist. Getting it out would require cutting deeper, doing more damage to reach the piece of metal that was slowly killing him. Ember's hands were steady, but her heart was racing. One wrong move, one slip of the blade, and she could sever the artery that ran through his leg. He'd bleed out in minutes, and there would be nothing she could do. She made the incision, following the wound channel, peeling back layers of tissue with her forceps. Blood welled up, but not the arterial spray she feared. The bullet glinted in the firelight, a misshapen lump of lead that had mushroomed on impact. She got the forceps around it, felt it resist as the muscle tried to hold it in place, and pulled with steady pressure. It came free with a wet sound that made her gorge rise. She dropped the bullet into her hand, staring at the thing that had nearly killed him, then threw it into the corner with more force than necessary. The wounds were clean now, or as clean as she could make them. She packed them with the echinacea paste, then with fresh poultices of yarrow and honey she'd harvested from wild bees. The stitching took another hour, her fingers working by feel as much as sight, pulling torn flesh back together with tiny, precise stitches her mother would have approved of. By the time she tied off the final thread, the sun was rising outside, and Ember was swaying with exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. The fever still raged, and fever could kill as easily as infected wounds. She needed to bring his temperature down, needed to get fluids into him before dehydration finished what the bullets had started. She mixed a tea from willow bark and devil's claw, bitter enough to make her own mouth pucker, and began the painstaking process of spooning it between his lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some went down his throat. It would have to be enough. She spent the rest of the day in a haze of exhaustion and vigilance. Every few hours, she checked his bandages, changed the poultices, forced more tea down his throat. She sponged his burning skin with cool water from her precious reserve, whispering prayers she'd learned as a child, and half-forgotten curses she'd learned as an adult. The fever climbed higher as the day wore on, and with it came the delirium. Lockney began to speak in his unconsciousness, his voice rising and falling in a language Ember didn't understand. Sometimes it was angry, sharp words that sounded like commands or warnings. Other times it was softer, almost pleading, and she wondered if he was calling for his mother or someone he loved. Once his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes flying open but seeing nothing, looking through her at something only the fever could show him. He said something urgent, desperate, and then his grip loosened and he fell back into the depths. It was during one of these fever dreams that Ember heard the horses. Multiple horses moving slowly, searching. She froze, her hand still on Lockney's forehead, and listened with every fibre of her being. The riders were close, maybe a quarter-mile away, following the arroyo that led past her shelter. Voices drifted on the wind, speaking in Modoc. They were looking for someone. Looking for him. Ember's mind raced through options, none of them good. If they found her shelter, they'd find their warrior. They might be grateful, or they might assume she'd harmed him. The safest thing would be to go out, to show herself, to explain what had happened. But the memory of Thomas Wilder's fists, of the way men's gratitude could turn to violence in a heartbeat, kept her frozen. She'd learned the hard way that being alone and female meant trusting no one. The horses drew closer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. She could hear the creak of leather, the jingle of tack. And then, miraculously, they began to move away, heading further down the arroyo. They hadn't seen her shelter, camouflaged as it was against the adobe cliff. Or perhaps they had, and dismissed it as abandoned, another relic of failed dreams in an unforgiving land. Either way, the sounds faded, and Ember released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But the close call shook her. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, couldn't keep hiding with a warrior who was radiating fever like a beacon. His people were searching in patterns, methodically covering ground. Eventually they would find this place. And when they did, she needed Lochne alive and conscious enough to explain what had happened. She needed him to be her salvation, not her death sentence. The fever broke on the third night. Ember had been dozing fitfully beside him, jerking awake at every sound, when she felt the change. His skin was no longer blazing. The desperate, rattling quality of his breathing had eased. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt coolness, blessed coolness, and something broke inside her chest. Relief so intense it was almost painful. He was going to live, against every odd, with nothing but her skill and stubbornness. She'd dragged him back from death's door. She must have fallen asleep then, truly asleep for the first time in days. Because when she woke it was to find him staring at her, not the glazed, fever-blind stare of before, but clear, conscious awareness. His dark eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how close they were, how vulnerable she was. His hand moved, not toward a weapon this time, but to touch his bandaged side, feeling the stitches beneath the cloth. Ember sat up slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. She reached for her water skin and held it out to him, just as she had before. This time he took it without hesitation, drinking deeply before handing it back. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but the English was clear, accented but understandable. "You pulled the bullet," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Ember replied, matching his directness. "You were dying. The infection was spreading. I did what I could." She gestured to the discarded, blood-stained cloths, the medical tools still laid out nearby. "You're not out of danger yet, but the fever broke. If you rest, if you let the wounds heal, you'll live." Lochne's eyes moved around the shelter, taking in every detail. The poverty of it, the makeshift nature of everything, the bundles of herbs and the obvious isolation. "You live here," he said. Another statement, not a question. "Alone, why?" It was a loaded question, one that demanded truth. Ember could lie, could give him some sanitized version of events. But something about the way he looked at her, the way he'd already trusted her with his life, whether he'd meant to or not, made lies feel impossible. "Because I killed my husband," she said flatly. "Or I think I did. I don't know if he died or if he just let everyone think I killed him. Either way, I ran. I've been here 3 years." She met his eyes, refusing to look away. "The people in Salvation Ridge think I'm dead or mad. The soldiers don't know I exist. Your people knew I was here but left me alone. Until now." Lochne processed this in silence, his face unreadable. Finally he said, "You saved an enemy. Why?" It was the same question his eyes had asked when he'd first woken in the canyon. Why would a white woman save a Modoc warrior? Why risk everything for a stranger? Ember thought about her mother, about the lessons that had been beaten into her soul, about the moment she'd seen his hands slip and made a choice that defied all logic. "Because you were dying," she said simply, "and I know how to stop that. It's what I was taught. It's who I am, or who I was supposed to be before everything fell apart." She paused, then added with brutal honesty, "And because I saw your eyes. You were fighting so hard to live. I couldn't walk away from that." Something shifted in Lochne's expression, a softening around the edges of his hardness. "My name is Lochne," he said, "son of Makia, war leader of the Modoc people." He said it with quiet pride, a statement of identity. The soldiers were hunting a raiding party. "We took cattle from their fort, cattle they stole from our hunting grounds. They caught us in the open. My horse was shot. I fell. I crawled." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I thought I would die alone in the sand. And then I saw you—" "Ember," she said, offering her name in return. "Ember Wilder. Former wife, current outcast, occasional healer." She tried for a wry smile and almost managed it. "I dragged you 2 miles on a travois. You're heavier than you look." That surprised a sound from him, not quite a laugh, but close. The tension in the air eased fractionally. They were no longer warrior and enemy, patient and healer. They were 2 people who'd somehow stumbled into each other's survival. "My father will be searching," Lochne said, and now there was worry in his voice. The war leader's son missing and presumed dead. He will not stop until he finds me or my body. And if he finds me here with you—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Ember understood the implications. A white woman alone with his wounded son. It could be seen as rescue or as an attempt to hold him hostage. Trust between their peoples had been shattered too many times. "Then you need to be strong enough to speak for me when they come," Ember said practically. "You need to heal fast. Can you sit up?" Lockney gritted his teeth and tried. He made it halfway before the pain in his side made him gasp and fall back. "Not yet," Ember said, pushing him down gently.
"You tore muscle."
"The stitches need time to hold. A few more days, maybe a week." "I don't have a week," Lockney said urgently. "Every day I'm missing, the situation grows worse. My father, he's been meeting with other Modoc leaders. There's talk of joining forces, of pushing back against the soldiers who keep taking our land. But there are those who argue for peace, for negotiation. I was supposed to be at those meetings. I was supposed to stand with my father." His hand clenched into a fist. "Without me, the war faction grows stronger. Without me, my father makes choices out of grief." Ember understood politics, even the politics of war. She'd seen enough of it in Salvation Ridge, the way fear and anger could push reasonable men toward violence. "Then we get you strong enough to travel," she said decisively. "I'll make a brace for your leg, something to support the weight. I'll pack the wounds with extra dressing so they don't tear. And we'll get you to your people before your father does something he can't take back." "We?" Lockney's eyes sharpened on her. "You would come with me? To a Modoc camp?" The disbelief in his voice was clear. White people didn't walk into Modoc camps, not unless they were soldiers or missionaries, and both tended to leave in pieces. "You would not be safe," Ember laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm not safe here. I'm not safe anywhere. At least with you, I have a chance of explaining before they decide I'm an enemy. You said it yourself, your father is looking for you. When he finds this place, and he will, I'd rather you be conscious and able to tell him I'm not the villain." It was calculated truth. Ember had no illusions about her situation. The moment the Modoc found her shelter, her isolation ended. She could run, disappear deeper into the desert, but that was just dying slower. Or she could face the storm head-on, with Lockney as her shield and her proof. It was a gamble, but everything about the last 3 days had been a gamble, and so far she'd won. Lockney studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words, judging her intent. Finally he nodded slowly. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Ember Wilder," he said. "I have not decided which, but you saved my life when you could have let me die. That debt is sacred. I will speak for you. I will make my father understand." It was a promise, and Ember could hear the weight of it. Among his people, she suspected, such promises were not given lightly. The next 3 days were a strange, suspended existence. Ember cared for Lockney's wounds, changing bandages and forcing him to drink her medicinal teas despite his grimaces at the taste. He in turn began to teach her words in his language. Simple things at first: water, fire, pain, thank you. She repeated them carefully, her tongue struggling with sounds it had never made before. He corrected her pronunciation with surprising patience. And slowly, communication became easier. Lockney told her about his people, about the Modoc way of life that was being strangled by the encroachment of settlers and soldiers. He spoke of the lava beds to the north, a sacred place where his people had lived for generations before being forced onto a reservation with their traditional enemies. He spoke of his father, Makya, a man caught between the old ways and the terrible new reality. And he spoke of himself, a son trying to live up to a legacy while believing there had to be a path that didn't lead to extinction. In turn, Ember found herself speaking about things she'd never told another soul. About her mother's gentle hands and sharp mind, about her father's weakness and debts, about Thomas Wilder's cruelty and the moment she'd struck back, about the 3 years of isolation that had felt like both punishment and salvation. Lockney listened without judgment, his dark eyes steady on her face. And for the first time since she'd fled into the desert, Ember didn't feel like a ghost. On the 4th day, Lockney managed to sit up without passing out. On the fifth, he stood, leaning heavily on a crutch Ember had fashioned from mesquite wood. On the sixth, they heard the drums, low and rhythmic coming from the north, a sound that seemed to resonate in the bones. Lochne's head snapped up, his whole body going tense. "They're calling the warriors," he said quietly. "My father is gathering the war party." "We're out of time!" Ember helped him outside, supporting his weight as they moved into the harsh morning light. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles away, she could see smoke rising. Multiple fires, which meant multiple camps. The Modoc were consolidating, preparing for something big. Lochne stared at the smoke, his jaw tight, and she could see the war between duty and survival playing out in his eyes. "Can you ride?" Ember asked. She had no horse, but there were wild mustangs in the territory, and she knew where they watered. It would be dangerous, foolish even, to try to catch one. But walking 5 miles on a wounded leg would kill Lochne as surely as infection. He looked at her, reading the determination in her face, and something like respect flickered in his expression. "I can ride," he said. "The question is, can you?" It was a challenge and a test. Ember had ridden as a girl, before her father had sold their horses to pay his debts. She hadn't been on a horse in years, but she'd survived 3 years in a desert that killed men regularly. She could survive this too. "I guess we'll find out," she said. And despite everything, despite the danger and the fear and the impossibility of what they were about to attempt, Lochne smiled. It transformed his face, made him look younger, almost carefree. And Ember realized with a start that she'd never seen him smile before, had only known him in pain and fever and grim determination. This version of him, this glimpse of who he was beneath the warrior, was something precious. They set out together as the sun climbed higher, 2 improbable allies heading toward a Modoc war camp. One a warrior fighting to prevent a war, the other an outcast fighting to prove she was more than the crimes she'd fled. Neither of them knew if they'd survive the next day, but they moved forward anyway, because standing still meant death. And both of them had already decided they were done dying. The Mustang watering hole was exactly where Ember remembered it. A spring-fed pool, hidden in a cluster of rock formations that looked like the fingers of a giant hand reaching from the earth. She discovered it during her first desperate months in the desert, following a trail of coyote tracks that had led her to salvation. The wild horses came here at dawn and dusk, and if luck was with them, they'd arrive just as the herd did. Lochne leaned heavily against a boulder, his face grey with exhaustion despite his best efforts to hide it. The journey from Ember's shelter had taken 4 hours, with frequent stops to rest his wounded leg. The makeshift crutch was holding, but every step sent jolts of pain through him that Ember could read in the tightness around his eyes. He was running on pure determination now, and determination had limits even for warriors. "We wait," Ember whispered, crouching beside him in the shade. The sun was climbing toward its apex, turning the desert into a shimmering hell of heat and light. "They'll come for water when the heat breaks. We'll have 1 chance to get a rope on one, maybe 2 if we're lucky." She pulled out the length of rope she'd brought, checking the loop she'd tied. It wasn't a proper lasso, nothing like what the vaqueros used, but it would have to serve. Lochne watched her with an expression that might have been amusement if he'd had the strength for it. "You have done this before?" he asked, his voice dry as the sand around them. Ember shot him a look that was equal parts defiance and honesty. "Once. I got the rope around a yearling's neck, and it dragged me 1/2 mile before I let go. I couldn't move my arms for 3 days. She paused, then added, "But I learned from my mistakes. This time will be different. This time you have help," Lochne said, straightening despite the obvious pain it cost him. "Among my people, I am known as one who speaks with horses. My grandfather taught me the old ways, how to approach them with respect, how to show them you are not a predator." He looked at the distant rock formations, his eyes taking on a faraway quality. "If I can get close enough to touch one, I can gentle it. But I will need you to drive them toward me, to make them choose between running past me or away from water." It was a plan born of desperation and cross-cultural knowledge. The kind of impossible collaboration that should never work. But they had no other options. Ember nodded, positioning herself on the opposite side of the spring, hidden behind a stand of prickly pear. Lochni settled into the shadows of the rocks, making himself small and still, becoming part of the landscape in a way that spoke of years of hunting and patience. They waited as the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent. The heat was murderous, pressing down like a physical weight. Ember's lips cracked and bled. Her water supply was dangerously low. Beside her, a rattlesnake emerged from beneath a rock, sensed her presence, and wisely retreated. Time stretched and compressed, marked only by the movement of shadows and the slow burn of desperation. Then, as the sun touched the western horizon, they came. 7 horses, ranging from a scarred old stallion to a pair of yearlings still learning their legs. They approached the water with the wariness of prey animals, heads high, nostrils flaring to test the wind. The stallion led, his coat the color of dried blood, his eyes sharp with intelligence and suspicion. Behind him came 3 mares, their sides hollowed by the harsh summer. And bringing up the rear were the youngsters. Ember waited until they were all drinking, their heads lowered to the pool. Guards momentarily dropped in the face of thirst. Then she stood, slowly at first, giving them time to register her presence. The stallion's head snapped up, water streaming from his muzzle. He screamed a warning, a sound like tearing metal, and the herd exploded into motion. But Ember was already moving, waving her arms, shouting wordlessly, driving them not away from the water but parallel to it, forcing them toward the rock formations where Lochni waited. The stallion tried to break left, to lead his herd around the obstacle, but Ember cut him off with a thrown rock that cracked against stone near his hooves. He wheeled furious and charged straight toward the rocks. Lochni rose from the shadows like a spirit, his hand outstretched, his voice rising in a sound that was half song, half prayer. The words were Modoc, ancient and rhythmic, the kind of sounds that predated language and spoke directly to something primal. The stallion skidded to a halt, his hooves throwing up clouds of dust, his body trembling with the urge to flee. But Lochni kept speaking, kept singing, his hand steady and open. The stallion's ears flickered forward. His nostrils flared, taking in Lochni's scent, reading the story written in sweat and blood and medicine. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and horse stared at each other, 2 wild things, recognizing something familiar in the other's eyes. Then impossibly, the stallion took a step forward, and another, until his nose touched Lochni's palm. Ember didn't breathe, didn't move. She watched as Lochni's fingers traced the stallion's jaw, his touch gentle but sure, his voice never stopping its low, rhythmic cadence. The other horses had scattered, but were watching from a distance, confused by their leader's behavior. The stallion's eye, huge and dark, fixed on Lochni with an intensity that seemed almost human. And then, with a snort that might have been acceptance or resignation, he lowered his head. Getting onto the stallion's back was another challenge entirely. Lochni couldn't put full weight on his injured leg, and the horse, however gentled, was still wild and unpredictable. Ember approached slowly, speaking her own nonsense words of comfort, and together they managed to get Lochni mounted. He sat bareback, his fingers twisted in the stallion's mane, his face tight with pain but his posture proud. He looked, Ember thought with a strange flutter in her chest, exactly like what he was. A warrior, a leader, someone born to this land in ways she would never be. The second horse was easier. A young mare, curious and less skittish than her elders, allowed Ember to slip the rope around her neck after only a few minutes of patient coaxing. She wasn't as magnificent as the stallion, her coat a dusty brown, marked with old scars, but she was sturdy and her eyes were kind. Ember pulled herself onto the mare's back, feeling muscles she'd forgotten she had protest the unfamiliar position. The mare danced sideways, testing this new weight, but Ember held firm, murmuring the same meaningless comfort sounds until the horse settled. They rode north as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Lochni led, guiding the stallion with nothing but pressure from his legs and quiet words. Ember followed, her mare content to trail the dominant male, her own inexperience offset by the horse's willingness. The drums they'd heard that morning were louder now, closer, a heartbeat rhythm that seemed to pulse up through the ground itself. As darkness fell, they saw the fires. Not the scattered campfires of a small group, but dozens of them, spread across a wide valley between two mesa formations. The Modoc had gathered in numbers Ember had never imagined, bringing together bands that normally ranged across hundreds of miles. Even from a distance, she could see the movement of people between fires, could hear the rise and fall of voices, of chanting of preparation. Lochni pulled his stallion to a halt on a ridge overlooking the encampment, and Ember drew up beside him. In the firelight below, she could see wickiups and lean-tos, horses corralled in makeshift pens, and what looked like a central fire pit surrounded by seated figures. Warriors moved with purpose, checking weapons, gathering in small groups for discussions she couldn't hear. Women worked at cooking fires, and children ran between the structures, their laughter carrying on the night wind. "That is my father's fire," Lochni said quietly, pointing to the largest blaze at the center of the camp. "He will be there with the other leaders, planning." His jaw tightened. "Planning the war I was supposed to help prevent." He looked at Ember, and in his eyes she saw fear for the first time since she'd found him bleeding in the sand. Not fear for himself, but for what his absence might have cost his people. "Then we go down there and you tell them you're alive," Ember said with more confidence than she felt. "You tell them whatever you need to tell them to stop this war." She paused, then added, "And I'll try not to get killed in the first 5 minutes." Lochni's mouth quirked, that same almost smile she'd seen before. "Stay close to me. Do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your eyes down but not too far down. Show respect but not fear. And if anyone tries to harm you—" He broke off, his hand moving to touch the knife Ember had returned to him that morning. "You'll protect me," Ember finished for him. "I know, I'm trusting you, Lochni, with my life. Don't make me regret pulling that bullet out." It was meant to be light, a joke to ease the tension, but it came out raw and honest. She was trusting him, trusting that his word meant something, that the debt he claimed to owe her was real. It went against every lesson the last 3 years had taught her about self-reliance and trusting no one. They descended into the valley as full night settled, 2 riders on wild horses approaching a war camp. Sentries spotted them when they were still 100 yards out, warriors materializing from the darkness with weapons ready. Lochni raised his hand in greeting, calling out in Modoc, his voice carrying across the space between them. The sentries' postures shifted from aggressive to shocked. One of them dropped his bow and sprinted toward the central fire, shouting. By the time Lochni and Ember reached the edge of the camp, they were surrounded by Modoc warriors, their faces painted for war, their expressions ranging from joy to suspicion to outright hostility. They crowded close to Lochni, calling his name, reaching up to touch his leg, as if to verify he was real. But their eyes kept flickering to Ember, to her white skin and strange clothes. And the questions in those looks were sharp as knives. A path opened through the crowd, and a man emerged from the central fire. He was perhaps 50, his hair streaked with grey, but his body still powerful, still radiating the kind of authority that needed no announcement. His face was weathered by sun and time, marked with old scars that spoke of battles survived. But it was his eyes that held Ember frozen. They were Lochni's eyes, dark and intense, but carrying the weight of years and responsibility. This was Makia, war leader of the Modoc, and the expression on his face as he looked at his son was naked relief, followed immediately by fury. Makia strode forward and grabbed Lochni's arm, pulling him down from the stallion with a force that made Lochni gasp in pain. Then, before anyone could react, Makia pulled his son into an embrace so fierce it looked like it might break bones. He spoke rapidly in Modoc, his voice thick with emotion, and Lochni responded in kind, his own voice cracking. Father and son, warrior and heir, 2 men who'd thought they'd lost each other. Then Makia pulled back, his hands on Lochni's shoulders, and saw the bandages beneath his son's torn clothing. His eyes went hard, He turned to look at Ember, still mounted on the mare, frozen under the weight of dozens of hostile stares. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, learned from years of negotiations and betrayals. "Who is this white woman? Why does she ride with my son?" It was not a friendly question. Lockney stepped between his father and Ember, a protective gesture that made several warriors mutter among themselves. "This is Ember Wilder. She found me dying after the soldiers ambushed us. She pulled a bullet from my leg, fought infection, and brought me back from the edge of death. Without her, your son would be feeding the vultures." He said it loudly, making sure everyone could hear, making it a declaration. "She saved my life, father. And by the laws of our people, that makes her sacred." The camp had gone silent. Ember could feel hundreds of eyes on her, judging, weighing, deciding if she was savior or threat. Makia's face was unreadable, a leader's mask that revealed nothing. "Sacred," he repeated slowly. "A white woman. Sacred to the Modoc." He looked at his son, searching for deception or enchantment, seeing only truth. "You trust her?" It was a simple question with enormous implications. "With my life," Lockney said without hesitation. "As she trusted me with hers by coming here," he gestured to Ember. "She has no people, father. Her own kind cast her out. She lives alone in the desert, surviving by the same knowledge our healers use. She asks nothing but safety and the chance to prove her worth." It was a carefully constructed argument, appealing to Modoc values of honor, debt, and the sacredness of healers. But Ember could see it wasn't working. Makia's eyes remained cold, calculating. He'd survived this long by trusting no white person, and one woman's actions wouldn't undo years of betrayal. Then from the crowd, an old woman emerged. She was tiny, bent with age, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of hard living and harder wisdom. She moved with the slow authority of someone who'd earned respect through decades of service, and the warriors parted for her without question. She approached Ember's horse, looking up with eyes that were milky with cataracts, but somehow seemed to see everything. She spoke in Modoc, her voice thin but clear, directing her words to Makia. The war leader listened, his expression shifting from hard to thoughtful. Lockney translated quietly for Ember's benefit. "She is Nokomis, my grandmother, our tribe's healer. She says she has dreamed of a white medicine woman who would come from the desert. She says the spirits told her this woman would bring both danger and hope, that she would be tested and prove herself worthy." Nokomis reached up, gnarled fingers surprisingly strong, and pulled Ember's hand down from where it gripped the mare's mane. She examined Ember's palm, tracing the lines and scars, muttering to herself. Then she looked up and smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. Nokomis said something else, longer this time, and several people in the crowd gasped. Lockney's face went carefully neutral. Makia's eyes narrowed. "What did she say?" Ember asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lockney met her eyes, and she saw something in them she couldn't quite identify. "Respect, worry?" "She says you carry the mark of the healer, that your hands have brought back the dead, not just my body but my spirit. She says you will be tested by fire and blood, and only then will the tribe know if you are friend or enemy." It was a prophecy and a warning. Ember was being granted entry to the camp, but it came with conditions. She would have to prove herself, would have to demonstrate her worth beyond simply saving Lockney's life. And failure would mean death, probably in ways she didn't want to imagine. Makia spoke, his voice carrying across the camp, making a declaration. Ember didn't need translation to understand the gist. She was to be allowed to stay under guard, under scrutiny. She was Lockney's responsibility, his burden to bear. And if she proved to be a threat, it would be Lockney who paid the price alongside her. As warriors came forward to help Lockney walk, his wounded leg finally giving out after the long ride, Ember was surrounded by a group of women. Their faces were not friendly, but they weren't overtly hostile either, curious, wary. They led her toward a small wickiup on the edge of the camp, gesturing for her to dismount. The mare was led away by a young boy who whispered soothingly to the nervous horse. Ember followed the women, feeling like a prisoner despite the lack of bonds. Inside the wickiup, she was given water and a bowl of something that might have been stew. The women watched her eat, whispering among themselves in their language. One of them, younger than the others, with a scar across her cheek, pointed at Ember's medical bag and said something that sounded like a question. Ember opened the bag slowly, showing them the herbs and tools inside. The women leaned closer, examining each item with the careful attention of those who understood medicine. One of them pointed at a bundle of yarrow and nodded approvingly. Slowly, carefully, Ember demonstrated how she used the herbs, how yarrow stopped bleeding, how willow bark reduced fever, how echinacea fought infection. The women watched, asked questions in their language that she couldn't answer, but the universal language of healing crossed barriers that words could not. By the time the demonstration was over, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to cautious interest. These were not enemies. These were fellow healers, recognizing one of their own despite the color of her skin. That night, lying on a borrowed blanket in the wickiup, listening to the drums and chanting from the central fire, Ember realized the full weight of what she'd done. She'd walked into a war camp, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her. She'd placed her life in the hands of a man she'd known for less than a week. She'd agreed to be tested by fire and blood, whatever that meant. It was insanity. It was suicide. But for the first time since she'd struck Thomas Wilder and fled into the desert, Ember felt like she existed. Not as a ghost, not as an exile, but as a person with purpose. These people didn't know about her past, didn't care about the scandal or the shame. They only cared about what she could do, what she could offer. It was terrifying. It was liberating. Outside, Lockney's voice rose in conversation with his father. Too distant for her to hear the words, but close enough to catch the tone. Serious, urgent, the sound of a son trying to convince a father that war was not the only path. Trying to explain that the woman sleeping in the wickiup was not a threat, but possibly a bridge. And Ember, listening in the darkness, sent up a prayer to whatever god or spirit might be listening that Lockney's words would be enough. Because tomorrow she would face her first test. And failure was not an option. Ember woke to screaming. Not the war cries she'd heard the night before, but the raw, primal sound of agony that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, and stumbled out of the wickiup into chaos. Warriors were running toward the eastern edge of camp, where smoke billowed black and thick against the lightening sky. The acrid smell of burning sage and something worse, something like charred meat, filled her nostrils. One of the women who'd watched her the night before grabbed Ember's arm, pulling her toward the commotion while speaking rapidly in Modoc. Ember didn't understand the words, but caught the urgency, the fear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. They ran together through the camp, dodging between structures, until they reached a crowd gathered around what had been a cook fire. Now it was a disaster. A large pot had overturned, spilling boiling water and hot coals across the ground, and in the center of the destruction sat a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 years old. His left arm and the side of his torso were blistered and raw, the skin already beginning to peel away in sheets. His face was contorted in agony, tears streaming down his cheeks as he wailed for his mother. A woman knelt beside him, her own hands burned from trying to pull him away, her face a mask of helpless terror. Around them, other Modocs stood frozen, uncertain, their fear of making things worse paralyzing them into inaction. Nokomis was there, the old healer, but Ember could see immediately that her hands were shaking too badly to work. Age and the severity of the burns had overwhelmed her. She was speaking, giving orders that no one seemed able to follow, and the desperation in her voice cut through the morning air. This child was going to die unless someone acted now, and everyone present knew it. Ember didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't consider how this might look or what it might mean. She pushed through the crowd, dropped to her knees beside the child, and began barking orders in English that her tone made universal. "Water! Clean water, not from the fire! And clay, red clay if you have it." She looked up at the faces staring at her with shock and suspicion. "Move now!" Something in her voice, the absolute authority of a healer in crisis, broke through their paralysis. The woman who'd brought her here ran for water. A warrior sprinted toward the creek bed, where clay deposits lined the banks. Ember turned her attention to the child, meeting his terrified eyes with her own steady gaze. "I know it hurts," she said softly, knowing he couldn't understand her words, but hoping he'd understand her tone. "I know you're scared, but I'm going to help you. I promise." She examined the burns with gentle fingers, her mind racing through her mother's teachings. The arm was worst, second-degree burns covering most of the surface. The torso was better, mostly first-degree, but the sheer coverage area made shock a real danger. She needed to cool the tissue, prevent infection, manage the pain, and do it all fast enough to keep the child from going into traumatic shock. The water arrived, and Ember immediately began pouring it over the burns, washing away debris and cooling the damaged skin. The boy screamed louder, instinct telling him the water was hurting him, but his mother held him still, understanding that this white woman was trying to help. Ember worked quickly, her hands steady, despite the child's cries, despite the hostile stares burning into her back. The clay came next. Thick, red mud that Ember mixed with water to create a paste. Her mother had taught her this technique from an old Cherokee healer who'd passed through their town when Ember was young. Clay drew out heat, prevented infection, and protected damaged skin from air exposure. She spread it carefully over the burns, speaking continuously in that same calm, steady voice, creating a layer of protection between the raw flesh and the world. But clay alone wouldn't be enough. She needed something for the pain, something to help the child rest so his body could begin healing. Ember looked up at Nokomis, who was watching her work with sharp, evaluating eyes, despite the tremor in her hands. "Willow bark," Ember said, miming drinking. "And poppy if you have it. Sleep medicine." Nokomis understood immediately. She spoke sharply to a young woman standing nearby, who darted away and returned minutes later with bundles of herbs. Together, the old Modoc healer and the white medicine woman worked in tandem, brewing a tea that would ease pain and bring sleep. Nokomis's knowledge combined with Ember's younger, steadier hands created something neither could have managed alone. Getting the tea into the child took patience. He was too traumatized, too hurt to want anything but his mother's arms. But Ember persisted, cooling the liquid, sweetening it with a precious bit of honey someone produced, coaxing sip by painful sip until the boy had consumed enough to matter. Within 20 minutes, his cries began to quiet. His eyes grew heavy. The medicine was working. Ember stayed with him as the sun rose fully, monitoring his breathing, adjusting the clay poultices as they dried, keeping his mother calm with gestures and tone, since words were useless. The crowd that had gathered gradually dispersed, but she could feel their eyes still on her, judging, weighing this moment against whatever prejudices they carried. She was being tested just as Nokomis had predicted, not by fire in the way she'd imagined, but by her response to it. By mid-morning, the child was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady, his color better than it had been. The burns were stabilized. He would scar, would carry the marks of this day for the rest of his life, but he would live. Ember sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted, and felt the weight of Nokomis's hand on her shoulder. The old woman spoke in Modoc, her voice carrying approval that needed no translation. Then she switched to broken English, piecing together words learned from missionaries long ago. "Good," Nokomis said simply. "You are healer, true healer. Not white, not Modoc, just healer." She squeezed Ember's shoulder with surprising strength. But test not over. Fire was first. Blood comes next. Before Ember could ask what that meant, a commotion erupted from the center of camp. Shouting, angry voices raised in argument. She turned to see warriors gathering near Makya's fire, their body language aggressive, confrontational. Lockney was there, standing despite his wounded leg, his voice rising above the others as he argued with a group of men who looked ready to draw weapons. Ember stood, swaying slightly from exhaustion and lack of food, and started toward the confrontation. Nokomis grabbed her wrist, holding her back with that deceptive old woman's strength. "No," she said urgently. "Warrior's business. You go, make worse." But Ember could see Lockney's face, could read the frustration and barely contained anger there. Whatever was happening, it involved him, and possibly her. She gently extracted her wrist from Nokomis's grip. "He spoke for me," she said quietly. "If there's trouble because of that, I need to know." She moved through the camp, drawing stares from women at cooking fires and children who scattered at her approach. As she got closer to the warrior circle, she began to pick up words in English, thrown like weapons into arguments conducted mostly in Modoc. White woman, spy, weakness, betrayal. The hostility was palpable, a physical presence in the air. Lockney saw her approaching, and his face went through a series of emotions, ending on something like resignation mixed with defiance. He said something to the warriors, gesturing toward her, and the circle opened slightly to admit her. Inside, she found herself facing Makia and 3 other men who had the bearing of leaders. One of them, a warrior with a face like carved stone, and eyes that held nothing but contempt, was speaking rapidly, jabbing his finger toward Ember like he was pronouncing sentence. Makia held up a hand, silencing the stone-faced warrior, and turned to Ember. His expression was unreadable, the leader's mask firmly in place. "This is Takoda," he said, indicating the hostile warrior. "He leads the war faction. He says you are a spy, sent by the soldiers to learn our numbers and plans. He says my son has been bewitched by white magic, that his judgment is compromised by your healing." Makia paused, and Ember could see the calculation in his eyes. "He demands that you be questioned, with pain if necessary to ensure truth." The threat was clear. Torture. They wanted to torture her to prove she wasn't a spy, because apparently saving Lockney's life and a burned child weren't proof enough of her intentions. Ember felt cold fury wash through her, burning away the exhaustion and fear. She'd survived 3 years in the desert, had clawed her way to survival through determination and skill, and these men thought pain would break her. They had no idea what she'd already endured. "I am not a spy," Ember said, her voice carrying across the circle clear and hard. "I have no love for the soldiers who drove me into the desert. I have no loyalty to the people of Salvation Ridge, who would hang me if they found me. I'm alone because both your world and mine decided I wasn't worth keeping." She looked directly at Takoda, refusing to be intimidated by his hatred. "I saved your war leader's son because it was the right thing to do. Because I'm a healer, and that's what healers do. We save lives. We don't pick sides." Takoda spat on the ground at her feet, a gesture of ultimate contempt. He spoke in rapid Modoc, his voice dripping with scorn. Lockney translated his own voice tight with anger. "He says healers are political by nature, that every life saved is a choice about the future, that by saving me, you may have prevented him from becoming war leader, from leading the Modoc to victory against the white invaders. He says you're either spy or saboteur, and either way you deserve death." The circle of warriors muttered agreement. Even Makia looked troubled, caught between gratitude for his son's life and the political reality of leadership. Ember could see the calculation happening. One white woman's life weighed against the unity of his war council. It wasn't a difficult equation for a leader to solve. She was going to die here in this camp, surrounded by people she'd hoped to prove herself to. Then, Nokomis's voice cut through the tension like a knife through leather. The old woman had followed Ember after all, and now she stood at the edge of the circle, speaking with an authority that made even Takoda pause. She spoke for a long time, her thin voice somehow carrying weight beyond its volume, and Ember watched the warriors' faces change as they listened. When Nokomis finished, silence fell over the circle. Makia turned to Ember, and something had shifted in his expression. "My mother says you have passed the first test, the fire test. You saved a child when your own people would have let him die to avoid helping an enemy. She says this proves your healing is not political, not strategic. It is what you are." He paused, and Ember could see the struggle in his eyes. But Dakota is right that more proof is needed. "The blood test remains." "What is the blood test?" Ember demanded. She was tired of being judged, tired of proving herself to men who would never be satisfied. "Tell me what I have to do and I'll do it. But stop talking about me like I'm not standing right here." Her outburst surprised them. Women, especially white women, weren't supposed to speak to warriors that way. But Ember was done playing by rules that only applied to her. She'd survived too much to die meek and silent. Makia's lips quirked, almost a smile. "The blood test is simple," he said. "Our scouts have reported soldiers approaching from the south. A small group, perhaps 20 men, led by an officer known for his cruelty toward my people. They are tracking the war party that ambushed them, the party where my son was wounded. They seek revenge." He gestured to the camp around them. "We have women, children, elders here, vulnerable ones who cannot fight. If the soldiers find us, they will not distinguish between warriors and innocents. They will kill all they can." Ember was beginning to understand where this was going, and cold dread settled in her stomach. Makia continued, his voice level. "The blood test is this. You will go to these soldiers. You will speak to them in your language, with your white face, and you will lead them away from this camp. You will tell them whatever lies are necessary to send them in the wrong direction." It was a test of loyalty that could only have one outcome. If she lied to the soldiers and they discovered it, they would kill her as a traitor. If she told them the truth about the camp's location, the Modoc would kill her as a spy. And if she refused to go at all, Dakota would probably kill her right here and now. "And if I succeed?" Ember asked quietly. "If I lead the soldiers away and survive? What then?" Makia looked at his son, then back at her. "Then you will have proven yourself. Then you will be welcome in this camp, not as a guest or a prisoner, but as one of us. Your past will not matter. Your skin will not matter. Only your actions." It was everything Ember had been searching for since she'd fled into the desert. Acceptance, belonging, a place where her past didn't define her future. All she had to do was walk into almost certain death to earn it. Lockney stepped forward, his face pale with worry. "Father, her injuries from the fire exhaustion, she needs rest before—" But Ember cut him off with a raised hand. She looked at Makia, at Dakota's sneering face, at the circle of warriors waiting for her to show weakness. "I'll do it," she said. "Tell me where these soldiers are, and I'll lead them so far astray they'll end up in California before they know what happened." She said it with more confidence than she felt, but confidence was all she had left. That and anger, the righteous fury of a woman who'd been pushed and tested and judged her entire life. She was done being afraid. If she was going to die, it would be on her feet, fighting, not cowering in a wiki-up waiting for someone else to decide her fate. The War Council dissolved, with grudging respect from some and continued suspicion from others. Dakota looked disappointed that she'd accepted the challenge, probably hoping she'd refuse and give him an excuse for immediate execution. Makia gave orders for scouts to brief Ember on the soldiers' location and movements. And Lockney, his face a storm of emotions, pulled her aside as the warriors dispersed. "This is madness," he said urgently, his hand gripping her arm. "These soldiers, they are led by Colonel Brennan. He's known for his hatred of all indigenous peoples and those who help them. If he suspects you've been with us, he'll torture you for information before he kills you." Ember met his eyes, seeing the concern there, the fear for her that he was trying to hide behind warrior stoicism. "I know," she said simply. "But what choice do I have? Stay here and wonder every day if Dakota will decide I'm too dangerous to live? Run back to the desert and spend the rest of my life alone?" She shook her head. "I'm tired of running, Lockney. I'm tired of being afraid. For once, I'm going to face the danger head-on. Then I'm coming with you," Lockney said firmly. Ember actually laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You can barely walk. Your wounds are still healing. And besides, a Modoc warrior showing up with me would defeat the entire purpose of this test. She placed her hand over his where it still gripped her arm. I need you here, keeping your father from starting a war while I'm gone. That's how you help me. That's how you repay whatever debt you think you owe. They stood like that for a moment, two people from different worlds who'd somehow become entangled in each other's survival. Then Lockney pulled something from around his neck, the leather cord with the bear claw she'd noticed before. He placed it in her hand, closing her fingers around it. This was my grandfather's. It protected him through 40 years of war. Maybe it will protect you through one day of lies. The weight of the gift, the trust implicit in it, nearly broke through Ember's carefully maintained composure. She nodded, unable to speak, and slipped the cord over her own neck. The bear claw settled against her chest, warm from Lockney's body heat, a talisman against the darkness ahead. 2 hours later, Ember rode out of camp on the dusty brown mare, now laden with supplies and a roughly drawn map showing the soldiers' last known position. The sun was high and merciless, the desert shimmering with heat that made the horizon dance and waver. Behind her, the Modoc camp disappeared into the landscape as if it had never been. Ahead, somewhere in the maze of canyons and mesas, 20 soldiers hunted for the warriors who'd killed their companions. And Ember Wilder, former wife, current outcast, occasional healer, rode toward them with lies on her tongue and a prayer in her heart. The blood test had begun, and only one thing was certain. By the time the sun set today, everything would have changed. Either she'd have proven herself worthy of the acceptance she craved, or she'd be dead. There was no middle ground, no safe harbor. Only the test and the fire of her own determination to pass it. The soldiers found her before she found them, which was probably for the best. Ember had been riding for 3 hours, following the map's crude markings, toward a canyon system where scouts had reported blue uniforms, when she heard the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked. She froze, hands raised slowly away from her body, heart hammering against her ribs as mounted figures emerged from behind rock formations on 3 sides. There were 8 of them in this advance party, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat. Their faces hard with the kind of vigilance that came from riding through hostile territory. The man who rode forward was young, perhaps 25, with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders and eyes that held too much caution for his age. His rifle was trained on Ember's chest, steady and unwavering. "Identify yourself," he barked, his voice sharp with tension. "What are you doing out here alone?" Ember let relief flood her face, an expression that required no acting whatsoever. A lone white woman encountering soldiers in the desert would be relieved, grateful, ready to collapse into the safety they represented. She let her hands shake as she lowered them to grip her saddle horn. "Thank God," she breathed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "I thought I was going to die out here. My name is Ember Caldwell. I was traveling with a wagon train from Santa Fe to California when we were attacked 3 days ago." The lie came smoothly, built on a foundation of truth about fear and survival. "Apaches, I think, or Modoc, I couldn't tell. They killed everyone. I only survived because I was gathering firewood away from camp when they struck." The lieutenant's rifle lowered slightly, but his suspicion remained. "A wagon train? We've had no reports of any wagon trains in this area, and you're awfully far north of the California Trail." Ember had anticipated this. The Modoc scouts had told her these soldiers were tracking the war party that had ambushed them, which meant they were looking for warriors, not refugees. She needed to redirect their focus completely. "We got lost," she said, letting frustration bleed into her voice. "Our guide took sick 2 weeks back, died of fever. And the man who took over didn't know the territory as well as he claimed. We were trying to find our way back to the main trail when the attack happened." She gestured vaguely to the south. "I've been riding in circles for days, trying to find help, trying to find anyone. I have no food left, almost no water." One of the other soldiers, an older man with sergeant's stripes, spoke up. "Lieutenant Dalton, she looks half-starved. And that's a wild horse she's riding, no saddle, no proper tack. Story could be true, Lieutenant Dalton studied Ember with those two old eyes, and she could see him calculating, weighing possibilities. A woman alone in the desert was unusual, but not impossible. Wagon train attacks happened with grim regularity, but something about the situation clearly troubled him. Where exactly was this attack? Dalton asked, his tone still sharp. "Show me on a map!" Ember's mind raced. She had to place the fictional attack far enough away to be plausible, but in a direction that would lead the soldiers away from the Modoc camp. She pulled out her own crude map, the one the Modoc had given her with the camp's location marked, and pointed to a spot she'd carefully memorized on the opposite side of the territory. "Here, I think, near a dried riverbed with 3 dead cottonwood trees. There were rock formations that looked like a sleeping giant." She was describing a real location, one the scouts had told her about, specifically because it was 40 miles from the camp and would take the soldiers days to reach and investigate. Dalton looked at his own, more detailed military map, tracing the area she'd indicated. "That's deep in Modoc territory," he said slowly. "Dangerous ground for a wagon train to be crossing." Ember seized on this, letting anger flash across her face. "You think I don't know that now? You think the families who died don't know it? Our guide assured us it was safe, that the Indians had moved north for the summer." He was wrong. Dead wrong. The anger was real, just redirected. Anger at Thomas Wilder, at the people of Salvation Ridge, at a world that had given her no good choices. Dalton seemed to make a decision. He holstered his rifle and dismounted, approaching Ember's horse with less hostility. "You look like you've been through hell, Miss Caldwell. We have water and some hardtack if you're hungry, but I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly." This was the dangerous part. Questions meant details, and details were where lies fell apart. But Ember had spent 3 years surviving on her wits. She could handle this. She dismounted carefully, accepting the canteen Dalton offered, and drank with the desperation of someone who'd been rationing water for days. "Have you seen any Indian activity in the last 3 days?" Dalton asked, watching her face carefully. "War parties, scouts, camps?" Ember shook her head. "Just emptiness. Rock and sand and more rock. I heard drums once 2 nights ago, but they were far off. I rode the opposite direction. It was perfect. Close enough to truth to be believable, but vague enough to be useless for tracking. We're hunting a Modoc war party," Dalton said, his voice hardening. "They ambushed one of our patrols 4 days ago, killed 3 men, wounded 2 more. We've been tracking them through these canyons, but they know the land better than we do. They keep slipping away." He leaned forward slightly. "If you've seen anything, any sign at all, it could help us find them before they kill more soldiers." Ember met his eyes and lied with absolute conviction. "I saw tracks yesterday heading northeast toward the lava beds. Unshod horses, at least a dozen. I avoided the area because I was afraid." She was sending them directly away from the camp, toward territory so rough and inhospitable that even the Modoc avoided it, except in dire circumstances. It would take the soldiers days to search it, and by then the camp could relocate. Dalton's expression shifted, excitement warring with continued suspicion. "Northeast? You're certain?" Ember nodded. "I'm not a tracker, Lieutenant, but I know what horse prints look like. And I know I didn't want to meet whoever made them." It was enough. Dalton turned to his sergeant. "Send a rider back to Colonel Brennan. Tell him we have a possible sighting, northeast toward the lava beds. We'll escort Miss Caldwell to the main camp and then move to investigate." The name Brennan sent ice through Ember's veins. She'd known the colonel was leading this expedition, but hearing his name from a soldier's lips made it real. This was the man Lockney had warned her about, the one known for his cruelty, and she was about to be brought directly to him. The ride to the main camp took 2 hours, with Ember surrounded by soldiers who treated her with a mixture of pity and wariness. Lieutenant Dalton rode beside her, asking occasional questions about the wagon train, about her background, about details that Ember had to invent on the spot. She claimed to be a widow, heading to California for a fresh start, playing into assumptions about helpless women seeking protection. It made her skin crawl, but it kept her alive. The main camp was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 60 soldiers arranged in military precision around a central command tent. Campfires burned despite the heat, and sentries walked the perimeter with rifles ready. This was not a casual patrol. This was a military operation with serious intent. And at the center of it, emerging from the command tent as they rode up, was Colonel Silas Brennan. He was not what Ember expected. She'd imagined a brute, scarred and crude, violence written in every line of his body. Instead, Brennan was refined, almost scholarly in appearance. Perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing his uniform with the precision of a man who believed in order above all else. But his eyes were what stopped her breath. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and utterly cold. The eyes of a man who could order deaths without losing sleep. "Lieutenant Dalton," Brennan said, his voice cultured, educated. "I see you've brought us a guest. How unexpected." There was something in his tone, a skepticism that made Ember's instincts scream danger. Dalton dismounted and saluted crisply. "Sir, this is Miss Ember Caldwell. She claims to be a survivor of a wagon train attack 3 days south of here. She's also reported seeing tracks heading toward the lava beds." Brennan's pale eyes fixed on Ember with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "A survivor? How fortunate for you, Miss Caldwell. And how convenient that you should encounter my men while we're hunting the very savages who supposedly attacked your wagon train." The word supposedly hung in the air like an accusation. Ember forced herself to meet his gaze, to show nothing but the exhausted gratitude of a rescued victim. "I don't know what you mean by convenient, Colonel. I've been praying for 3 days to find help, and when your soldiers appeared, I thought my prayers had been answered." Brennan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you did. Please, come sit. You must be exhausted. Lieutenant, have someone bring Miss Caldwell water and food. We wouldn't want our guests to think we lack hospitality. It was all wrong." The words were solicitous, but the tone was mocking. Brennan didn't believe her story, or at least he had serious doubts. Ember was led to a camp chair near the command tent, while a private brought her stale biscuits and water. Brennan dismissed Dalton and the other soldiers, then pulled up a chair across from her, close enough that she could see the calculation in those cold eyes. "Tell me about this wagon train, Miss Caldwell," he said conversationally. "How many wagons? How many people? Where exactly were you headed?" Ember repeated her story, keeping the details consistent with what she'd told Dalton, adding small touches that made it feel real. She described fictional families, invented names, created a tragedy that existed only in her words. And all the while Brennan watched her with that unsettling intensity. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a remarkable story. Tragic, certainly, but remarkable. There's just one problem." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been in this territory for 15 years, Miss Caldwell. I know every trail, every water source, every place a wagon train could reasonably travel. And the location you described, the one with the sleeping giant rock formation, no wagon train would go anywhere near there. The terrain is too rough, the water too scarce. Any guide worth his salt would know that." Ember's blood turned to ice, but she kept her face calm. "Then our guide wasn't worth his salt, Colonel. That's why he got us lost. That's why we're all dead except me." Brennan shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think that's it. I think you're lying, Miss Caldwell. And what I can't decide is why—" He stood towering over her, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Are you a Modoc sympathizer? A missionary who's been living among them? Or perhaps something more interesting?" Before Ember could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of camp. Soldiers were shouting, pointing toward the canyon entrance where a rider was approaching at full gallop. The rider was in uniform, one of the scouts sent out earlier, and his horse was lathered with sweat. He practically fell from the saddle, stumbling toward Brennan with urgent desperation. "Colonel, sir," the scout gasped. "We found them. The Modoc camp. Massive gathering. Maybe 200 warriors, 30 miles northwest. They're preparing for war, sir. War paint, weapons, the whole thing." Ember's heart stopped. The camp had been found. All her lies, all her misdirection meant nothing. The soldiers knew where the Modoc were, and they were about to march straight toward them. Brennan's face transformed, cold calculation replaced by fierce satisfaction. Outstanding. Lieutenant Dalton, assemble the men. We march within the hour. He turned back to Ember, and now there was no pretense of civility in his expression. It seems your information about tracks heading northeast was incorrect, Miss Caldwell. Unless you simply made a mistake in your exhausted state. The question was a trap. If she admitted to lying, she was a traitor. If she claimed confusion, she was incompetent. Either way, her usefulness was over. Bind her, Brennan ordered two nearby soldiers. She's either a spy or she's been compromised by the Modoc. Either way, she comes with us. When we've dealt with the savages, we'll deal with her. Rough hands grabbed Ember's arms, yanking them behind her back. Rope bit into her wrists, tied with military efficiency. She was hauled to her feet, her mind racing through options that were rapidly narrowing to zero. The blood test had failed. She'd been caught, and now she was going to watch helplessly as 60 soldiers marched on a camp full of families. But as the soldiers prepared to move out, as weapons were checked and horses saddled, Ember caught sight of something that sent a different kind of ice through her veins. On the horizon, barely visible in the afternoon heat shimmer, riders were approaching. Many riders, and they weren't wearing blue uniforms. The Modoc had come, whether as rescue or revenge. Whether Lockney had convinced his father to save her, or Takoda had convinced him she was a traitor worth retrieving for punishment, she didn't know. But they were coming, at least 50 warriors by her count, riding hard across the desert floor, with war cries beginning to echo off the canyon walls. Brennan saw them a moment later. His face went hard as stone. "Battle positions! Defensive formation! They've brought the fight to us, men, so we'll give them one they won't forget." The camp exploded into controlled chaos as soldiers grabbed weapons and formed lines. Ember was shoved roughly to the ground behind the command tent. A soldier posted to guard her with orders to shoot if she tried to run. She landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, and could only watch as two forces that shouldn't be colliding raced toward each other with deadly intent. The Modoc riders split into two groups as they approached, a tactical maneuver that forced the soldiers to divide their attention. War cries filled the air, a sound that made Ember's blood sing with primal recognition, even as her mind screamed at the wrongness of it all. This wasn't supposed to happen. The test was supposed to keep the soldiers away from the camp, not bring them into direct conflict. Then, from the center of the Modoc line, a single rider broke away and charged directly toward the camp. Even at a distance, even through the dust and chaos, Ember recognized the red stallion and the warrior who rode it. Lockney, his wounded legs strapped with support, his face painted for war, was riding straight into the teeth of 60 rifles. It was suicide. It was madness. It was the action of a man who decided that honor mattered more than survival. "Hold your fire!" Brennan's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. "Let him come. I want to see what this fool thinks he's doing." The soldiers obeyed, rifles trained on Lockney, but fingers off triggers. The Modoc warriors behind him had also stopped, holding position 50 yards out, creating a strange, frozen tableau of potential violence. Lockney rode to within 20 feet of the soldier line before pulling his stallion to a halt. When he spoke, his voice carried with practiced power, "I am Lockney, son of Makia, war leader of the Modoc people. I come under flag of temporary truce to make an exchange." He gestured behind him, and two warriors rode forward with a prisoner between them. The prisoner wore the tattered remains of a cavalry uniform, his face battered but recognizable. One of the soldiers from the original ambush, captured and held. "We return your soldier, unharmed except for wounds he received in battle," Lockney continued. "In exchange, you will release the white medicine woman you hold. She is under our protection. She has committed no crime against your people." Brennan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Under your protection? This woman is a citizen of the United States, and you have no authority over her." He stepped forward, his hand still on his pistol. But I'm curious. Why does a Modoc war leader's son care so much about one white woman that he'd risk his life to retrieve her? The question hung in the air, loaded with implication and danger. Lochne's eyes found embers across the space between them. In his gaze, she saw determination, respect, and something else she couldn't quite name. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less forceful. Because she saved my life when she could have let me die. Because she proved herself to my people through courage and skill. Because she belongs with us now, not with you. It was a declaration and a challenge. Brennan's face darkened with understanding and fury. So she is a traitor. A white woman who sides with savages against her own kind. Brennan drew his pistol, aiming it directly at Ember's head. Then perhaps the most merciful thing I can do is end her here. Save her from whatever degradation you have planned. The soldier guarding Ember grabbed her hair, forcing her head up, exposing her throat. This was it. The end of the blood test, the end of everything. Ember closed her eyes, gripping Lochne's grandfather's bear claw around her neck, and waited for the shot. It never came. Instead, the sound of a rifle shot cracked from the canyon rim above them, and the soldier holding Ember cried out, releasing her as blood bloomed from his shoulder. More shots followed, a deadly rain from multiple positions on the high ground. The soldiers scattered, seeking cover, as it became clear they were surrounded. Modoc warriors had positioned themselves on the ridges during the confrontation, turning the soldier camp into a killing ground. Makia's voice boomed from the ridge, speaking in English for Brennan's benefit. You have 3 choices, Colonel. Release the woman and your captured soldier goes free. Keep her and we kill you all. Or try to fight and die for certain. Choose quickly. It was not a negotiation. It was a demonstration of power. The Modoc had outmaneuvered the soldiers completely, turning their superior numbers and firepower into a liability in terrain they couldn't control. Brennan's face cycled through fury, calculation, and finally, bitter pragmatism. He was a military man, trained to recognize when a position was untenable. Keeping one woman wasn't worth losing 60 soldiers. He holstered his pistol with deliberate care. "Cut her loose," he ordered through gritted teeth. "And tell that savage war leader that this isn't over. Tell him I'll remember this." The rope around Ember's wrists was severed. She stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady, and began walking toward the Modoc line. Every step felt like a mile, every breath like it might be her last. Soldiers watched her with expressions ranging from relief to contempt to pity. She didn't look at any of them. She only looked at Lochne, waiting on his red stallion, with his hand extended toward her. When she reached him, he pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion. His arm wrapped around her waist, steady and sure. "Hold tight," he murmured, and then they were riding. The stallion wheeling and racing back toward the Modoc line as shots began to ring out from soldiers who couldn't accept defeat so easily. Bullets whined past them. One struck the ground near the stallion's hooves, but the horse didn't falter. They reached the Modoc warriors, who closed ranks around them like a living shield. Then as one, the entire war party turned and rode, leaving the soldiers behind in a cloud of dust and frustrated rage. The blood test was over, and somehow impossibly, Ember had survived. They rode for an hour before Makia called a halt in a canyon where ancient petroglyphs covered the walls like prayers written in stone. Ember slid from the stallion's back, her legs trembling with exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. Around her, warriors dismounted with the easy grace of men who'd been born on horseback, their war paint streaking with sweat, but their spirits high. They had outmaneuvered the soldiers, rescued their war leader's son's chosen woman, and avoided bloodshed. It was a victory worth celebrating, but Ember noticed that not everyone was celebrating. Takoda stood apart from the others, his face dark with anger, speaking urgently to a small group of warriors who looked equally displeased. She didn't need to understand Modoc to know they were arguing about her, about the risk her presence had brought, about whether saving one white woman was worth potentially starting a war with the cavalry. Makia dismounted and approached his son, gripping Lockney's shoulder with a mixture of pride and exasperation. They spoke in rapid Modoc, their body language telling a story of disagreement and understanding in equal measure. Finally, Makya turned to address the gathered warriors, his voice carrying the weight of leadership. Lockney translated quietly for Ember's benefit, standing close enough that his shoulder touched hers. "My father says the blood test is complete. You faced the soldiers, risked your life to protect the camp, and survived through courage and quick thinking. He says you have earned your place among us," but his voice held a note of concern. Takoda argues that the test failed, that the soldiers found the camp anyway, that your presence has brought danger rather than preventing it. He demands that you be sent away back to your people or into the desert. Ember's throat tightened. After everything, after proving herself again and again, there were still those who would never accept her. She started to step forward to argue her case, but Nokomis moved faster. The old healer walked into the center of the gathering, her voice thin but commanding. She spoke for several minutes, occasionally pointing at Ember, at Lockney, at the warriors themselves. When she finished, the camp had gone silent. What did she say? Ember whispered to Lockney. His expression was unreadable. She said that the spirits sent you to us for a reason, that your arrival saved my life, which prevented my father from making war out of grief. She said you healed a child that would have died, proving your medicine is stronger than anger. And she said that the world is changing, that the Modoc cannot survive by fighting alone. He paused, then added softly, "She said you are the bridge between worlds, and that burning bridges is what desperate people do." Makya spoke again, and this time his words needed no translation. He approached Ember directly, his weathered face serious but no longer hostile. "My son has chosen you," he said in his careful English. "Not as property, not as servant, but as partner. This is unusual. This is difficult. But I have seen your courage, your skill, your willingness to risk everything for people who are not your own." He placed his hand on her shoulder, the gesture formal and weighty. "You are welcome in this camp. You are welcome among the Modoc people. But you must understand what this means." He gestured to the assembled warriors, to the women and children who had emerged from hiding places to witness this moment. "If you stay with us, you leave your white world behind. You will be hunted by soldiers who see you as a traitor. You will be rejected by settlers who see you as savage. There is no going back, no return to the life you knew." His eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Are you willing to pay this price? To become Modoc not just in name, but in truth?" Ember thought about the question, really considered it. What was she giving up? A white world that had already rejected her, a society that had branded her murderer and outcast, a life of isolation and fear, of looking over her shoulder, of never being enough. She thought about Thomas Wilder's fists, about the people of Salvation Ridge who'd declared her dead without mourning her. She thought about 3 years in the desert, alone with ghosts and regrets. Then she thought about pulling Lockney from the sand, about the weight of him as she'd dragged him to safety. She thought about the burned child's mother weeping with gratitude, about Nokomis's approval, about the healing women who'd accepted her as one of their own. She thought about riding behind Lockney on the red stallion, his arm around her waist, the bear claw warm against her chest. She thought about belonging, real belonging, earned through action rather than blood. "I'm willing," Ember said, her voice steady and sure. "I have no world to go back to, but I could have a world here if you'll let me build it." Makya studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He spoke in Modoc, a declaration that made some warriors cheer and others grumble, but all accept. Lockney's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Welcome home," he murmured, and Ember felt something crack open in her chest. Something that had been locked tight since the night she'd fled into the desert. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Ember had experienced. There was singing and drumming, stories told around fires that made the canyon walls glow orange. Children who'd been wary of her now tugged at her skirt, asking questions in Modoc that she couldn't answer, but responded to with smiles. The healing women brought her into their circle, showing her plants she'd never seen before, teaching her names in their language. Slowly, carefully, she was being woven into the fabric of this community. As night deepened, Lochni led her away from the fires to a quiet spot beneath the petroglyphs. They sat together on sun-warmed stone, looking up at the ancient images of hunters and animals, and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. "Thank you," Ember said quietly, "for coming after me, for risking everything." Lochni shook his head. "You risked everything first. You pulled a dying warrior from the sand when any sane person would have left him. You stayed when you could have run. You faced soldiers and torture and possible death rather than betray people who weren't even your own." He turned to face her fully, his eyes reflecting firelight from the distant camp. "You saved more than my life, Ember. You saved my people from a war we couldn't win. My father was ready to lead every warrior in a final stand against the soldiers. He would have done it to avenge his son." Understanding dawned, cold and clear. "That's why Takoda is angry. Not because I'm white, but because my presence stopped a war he wanted." Lochni nodded grimly. "He believes that death with honor is better than slow extinction. That we should fight while we still can, even if we lose." My father was beginning to agree with him in his grief. "But then you brought me back, and suddenly there was another path. A harder path, but one that might lead somewhere other than graves." Ember leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "What happens now? The soldiers know where the camp was. They'll come back with more men." Lochni's arm came around her, protective and sure. "We move, the Modoc are used to moving, and my father will send messengers to other tribes. We'll try to build alliances rather than fight alone. It's what I've been arguing for, what you've made possible by showing that bridge building can work." He paused, then added, "But it won't be easy. There will be more Takodas, more people who see cooperation as weakness. And the soldiers won't forget what happened today. Colonel Brennan especially. Then we'll face it together," Ember said simply. "Whatever comes. Because I'm done running and I'm done being alone." Lochni turned her face toward his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You'll never be alone again. I swear it." When he kissed her, it was gentle and fierce all at once, a promise and a celebration, the sealing of something that had been building since the moment she'd refused to let him die. Around them, the desert wind carried the sound of drums and laughter. The ancient canyon walls holding witness to something new being born. 3 months later, Ember sat outside the winter camp's largest wiki-up, grinding dried meat into pemmican while Nokomis directed her with patient corrections. Her Modoc was still broken and heavily accented, but she could understand most conversations now. Her hands, already calloused from desert survival, had developed new calluses from tanning hides and weaving baskets. She wore clothing made from deer hide, decorated with beadwork that the healing women had taught her to create. Her sun-bleached hair was braided in the Modoc style, woven with shells and feathers. She looked like she belonged. More importantly, she felt like she belonged. The skepticism that had greeted her had slowly transformed into acceptance as she proved herself again and again. When a warrior was injured hunting, she set his broken leg with such skill that he walked without a limp. When winter sickness swept through camp, she worked alongside Nokomis for days, combining white medicine with Modoc, healing to save lives. When food was scarce, she taught them preservation techniques her mother had known. Slowly, carefully, she became not the white medicine woman, but simply Ember. Lochni emerged from the wiki-up, his leg fully healed now, walking with barely a trace of the old injury. He'd grown his hair longer, and Ember had woven a leather tie for him decorated with the bear claw he'd given her, returned with gratitude. He was preparing to ride out with his father, to meet with Paiute leaders, part of the alliance building that had become their strategy for survival. It was dangerous work, requiring diplomacy and courage in equal measure. "You could come with us," Lochni offered, not for the first time. "My father says your presence reminds other tribes that change is possible." Ember shook her head, smiling. "And leave Nokomis to handle winter preparations alone. She'd never forgive me. Besides, someone needs to keep Takoda from convincing the young warriors that war is the only answer." It was said lightly, but both of them knew the tension remained. Takoda had accepted Makya's decision, but not embraced it. He watched Ember with barely concealed resentment, waiting for her to fail, to prove his suspicions correct. Lokni crouched beside her, taking her hands in his. "When I return, we'll have the bonding ceremony. If you still want to—" Ember pulled him close, kissing him with all the fierce certainty she felt. "I want to. I've never been more sure of anything." As Lokni rode out with the alliance party, Ember returned to her work, surrounded by women who now called her sister, in a camp that had become home. The future was uncertain, full of dangers she couldn't predict. Colonel Brennan was still out there, still hunting. The settlers were still coming, still taking land. The old ways were still dying. But in the space between worlds, in the canyons where two peoples were learning to see each other as human, something new was being built. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And Ember Wilder, who'd pulled a dying warrior from the sand and refused to let him become just another casualty of hate, had become the bridge she'd never known she was meant to be. The desert wind carried the sound of her laughter as the healing women made jokes she was only beginning to understand. The sun set over canyon walls that had seen centuries of human struggle and survival. And somewhere in that vast, unforgiving landscape, a white woman and a Modoc warrior had found what everyone seeks, but few find. A place to stand, a people to stand with, and a love worth fighting for. The end. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.